You can tell a good director in about 5 minutes. Doesn't take longer. If you've been around at all, you spot a director in 5 minutes.
Richard Widmark was not just another actor who happened to find fame in Hollywood. He was something far more rare, a man who treated acting as a sacred craft, who carried himself with dignity both on and off screen, and who lived a life full of real love, real loss, and real purpose. His journey from a tiny town in Minnesota to the golden stages of Hollywood is one of the most remarkable stories the entertainment world has ever seen. If you enjoy hearing about the legends of classic Hollywood and the untold stories behind the westerns you grew up watching, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We dig deep into the lives of the stars who shaped cinema, and there is always something new to discover. Richard Widmark came into the world in the small, quiet town of Sunrise, Minnesota, but his family did not stay there long. Within his first year of life, his father, Carl Henry Widmark, who worked as a traveling salesman, moved the family to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was there that Richard's younger brother Donald was born on July 25, 1918. The two boys grew up close to each other, sharing a bond that would never break, no matter what life threw at them. From a very young age, Richard developed a deep love for movies, and he had one very special person to thank for that. His Scottish grandmother was a huge fan of cowboy star Tom Mix, and she made a habit of taking little Richard to the local cinema 2 or 3 times a week, starting when he was barely 4 years old. Those trips to the movies lit a fire in him that would burn for the rest of his life. The stories, the characters, the magic of the big screen. All of it captured his imagination in a way nothing else ever would. Because of his father's work, the family moved around quite a bit, but they eventually put down roots in Princeton, Illinois. Carl opened a small bakery called Henry's Bakery, and for the first time, the family had a real home they could settle into. Richard thrived in Princeton. He went to Princeton High School, played football, excelled in his studies, and even became class president in his senior year. He was the kind of young man people looked up to, confident, smart, and driven. But his junior year brought some pain. His parents separated, and his mother Ethel chose to stay in Princeton and raise the boys until they finished school. Richard pushed through that difficult time, and after graduating in 1932, he earned a scholarship to Lake Forest College, where he originally planned to study law. He kept playing football and even won 3rd place in a statewide speech competition. Slowly but surely, though, the pull of the stage became stronger than any courtroom ever could have been. He was hesitant to talk about his love for acting at first, worried people might think it was foolish, but that feeling kept growing inside him no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. Then something happened that would change his life completely. He met a fellow drama student named Aurora Jean Hazelwood. She had the same spark, the same dream, and the same passion for performance. Richard fell deeply in love with her. After graduating in 1936, he was invited to stay on at the college and help teach drama and speech classes, which he did for 2 years. But by 1938, he knew it was time to go after something bigger. He packed his bags and headed to New York City, hoping to break into radio broadcasting through a connection a friend had offered him. As luck would have it, Jean was also in New York at the time, studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Their paths had crossed again, and this time the connection would become permanent. Richard wasted no time getting to work, landing roles in radio dramas and keeping himself busy racing between studios across the city. His career was finally starting to move. Then came April 5, 1942, a date Richard never forgot. With the United States freshly drawn into World War II, he and Jean got married in her hometown of Evanston, Illinois. By every account, it was a partnership built on genuine love and deep respect. Richard often said that after meeting Jean, he never had eyes for anyone else. He once said simply, with a grin, that he happened to like his wife a lot. Their marriage would go on to last 57 years, an almost unheard of thing in Hollywood. When the war broke out, Richard tried to enlist in the military, but a perforated eardrum meant he was not accepted. His brother Donald was not so fortunate. He was drafted and sent to fight in Europe. In 1943, devastating news reached the family. Donald's plane was shot down over the Netherlands. He was the only one from his crew to survive, but he ended up spending over a year as a prisoner of war in a German prison camp. He eventually made it home, but he was never truly the same again. He suffered from terrible headaches and partial paralysis for years. Tragically, in 1955, Donald died from a brain tumor at just 37 years old. Richard had done everything in his power to support and care for his brother, and he carried the grief of that loss for the rest of his life. He often said that the government never truly grasped the depth of what Donald had suffered. Meanwhile, back in 1943, while war raged overseas, Richard's career on home soil was beginning to take shape. He made his Broadway debut in a play called Kiss and Tell and joined the American Theater Wing, performing for troops and keeping himself working steadily in radio and on stage. Then in 1945, he and Jean welcomed their only child, a daughter named Anne Heath Widmark, born on July 25th. Not long after, fate came knocking in a big way. A 20th Century Fox executive named Darryl F. Zanuck offered Richard the role of Tommy Udo in a film called Kiss of Death, which starred Victor Mature. The director, Henry Hathaway, was not on board at first. He thought Richard looked too sharp and refined, too intelligent to be convincing as a cold-blooded killer. But Zanuck held firm, and Richard got the part. The only reason Richard had even agreed to take the role was that the film was being shot in New York, where he wanted to stay. That one practical decision ended up changing the entire course of his life. In his very first film, and in his very first scene, Richard Widmark created one of the most unforgettable moments in Hollywood history. Playing Tommy Udo, he pushed a helpless elderly woman in a wheelchair down a flight of stairs and let out a chilling, maniacal laugh that left audiences genuinely disturbed. The scene became legendary overnight. It earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer. A man who had been a radio voice just a few years earlier was now one of the most talked-about new faces in all of Hollywood. Richard later joked that he thought acting was easy after that first film because he never won anything again after it. But behind that humor was a touch of genuine discomfort. He once admitted that the first time he saw himself on screen, he was horrified by what he saw. Still, audiences had a very different reaction. They loved to hate Tommy Udo, and Richard's performance made him an instant sensation. Impressed by what he had delivered, 20th Century Fox offered him a 7-year contract. Through the late 1940s, his career continued to climb. In 1948 alone, he starred in 3 films: Yellow Sky alongside Gregory Peck, Roadhouse with Celeste Holm, and The Street with No Name. The following year, he appeared with Lionel Barrymore in Down to the Sea in Ships. By 1950, the studio had enough confidence in him to put him in 2 major productions. The first was Panic in the Streets, directed by his old Broadway friend Elia Kazan, who had actually been the one to push him toward the Kiss of Death audition years earlier. The second was No Way Out, a racially charged drama that also starred Sidney Poitier and Linda Darnell. Richard played a violent racist, a role he initially flat-out refused, but studio pressure won out, and he reluctantly agreed to do it. After each intense scene with Poitier, Richard would turn to him and apologize, making sure his co-star knew it was just acting. Poitier would simply smile and remind him that he was an actor too, and he understood completely. The 2 men formed a deep and lasting friendship. Years later, Poitier revealed that Richard had been the first person in all of Hollywood to ever invite him to dinner, a small gesture, but one that meant the world to him. In 1951, Richard starred in Halls of Montezuma, a gripping World War II film that brought together a strong cast, including Carl Malden, Jack Palance, Richard Boone, and a very young Robert Wagner, who earned his first ever credited screen role in that picture. Then in 1952 came one of the more memorable chapters of his career, when he shared the screen with Marilyn Monroe in Don't Bother to Knock. Richard spoke about Marilyn with genuine tenderness in later years. He described her as a fragile soul, like a wounded bird, someone who desperately wanted fame but was frightened by the world around her. On set, she would sometimes lock herself in her dressing room for hours while everyone waited. Remembering her lines was a constant struggle, and her performance during filming often seemed all over the place. But when the movie was cut together and shown on the big screen, something remarkable happened. Marilyn shone. She looked radiant and vulnerable and completely captivating, and even Richard had to admit that when the camera loved her, nobody else in the room stood a chance. As for the Hollywood rumors about Marilyn's on-set romances, Richard was quick and firm in his response. Not with him, he said. She didn't even flirt. By 1954, he was back working alongside Robert Wagner, this time in Broken Lance with the great Spencer Tracy. That film also marked the end of his 7-year deal with 20th Century Fox. Richard was now 40 years old, and he was ready for something different. He was tired of the constant grind of going from one production to the next with no breathing room, and he wanted more control over the projects he chose and the pace of his life. His daughter Anne would later share that her father was, at his core, a family man, never happier than when he was home on their ranch in the San Fernando Valley, spending quiet evenings with the people he loved. Wanting to steer his own ship creatively, Richard founded his own production company, which he named Heath Productions, after Anne's middle name. But 1956 brought the kind of sorrow that no amount of professional success can ease. Within a single year, Richard lost both his younger brother Donald and his mother Ethel May. The weight of those losses never fully left him. Through the late 1950s, he kept working steadily, appearing in Time Limit in 1957, The Tunnel of Love with Doris Day in 1958, and The Law and Jake Wade alongside Robert Taylor that same year. His name was one of the most recognized in the business, but he carried it lightly. When asked whether fame had made a normal life impossible, he said quite calmly that any actor could live a normal life if they chose to, regardless of how well known they were. In 1960, Richard took on the role of Jim Bowie in John Wayne's big production of The Alamo. It was a role Wayne had initially resisted giving him, telling him bluntly that he wasn't big enough to play Jim Bowie. Richard just smiled and told him he would be, and he was. A year later came one of his most celebrated performances in Two Rode Together with James Stewart and Shirley Jones, directed by the legendary John Ford. Behind the scenes, the set was often tense because Ford and Stewart were constantly at each other's throats, mostly arguing about an old beat-up cowboy hat that Stewart insisted on wearing in every Western he made. Through all that friction, Shirley Jones later confessed that Richard Widmark had been the only leading man she ever truly fell in love with. She said both he and Stewart were so kind and protective toward her that she couldn't help herself, and she laughed that nothing ever actually came of it, which was probably for the best. That same year, he appeared in Judgment at Nuremberg, one of the most powerful courtroom dramas ever made, playing an American prosecutor opposite giants like Spencer Tracy and Burt Lancaster. In 1962, he was part of the enormous all-star ensemble in How the West Was Won, a film that brought together John Wayne, James Stewart, Gregory Peck, Henry Fonda, Debbie Reynolds, and Carol Picker, among others. Made on a budget of $15 million, the film pulled in over $50 million at the box office and stood as one of the defining westerns of its era. By 1964, Richard and Jean had settled into a peaceful life on a 20-acre estate in Connecticut. He continued to work through the mid to late 1960s, appearing in Alvarez Kelly in 1966 with William Holden and in The Way West in 1967. That second film reunited him on screen with Robert Mitchum and Kirk Douglas, two men he was famously not fond of. Then came the loss of his father Carl, who passed away in New Orleans at the age of 70, just 2 years after Alvarez. Now, this is a good moment to talk about the 5 actors Richard Widmark was known to have serious problems with. He never aired these opinions publicly, he was far too professional and private for that, but those who knew him well were very clear about where things stood. The first name on that list was Frank Sinatra. When the two worked together on The Detective in 1968, Richard was left fuming. Sinatra's habit of showing up late, doing minimal rehearsal, and wanting to wrap scenes as quickly as possible clashed hard with Richard's disciplined, perfectionist approach.
People who were on that set remembered Richard feeling that Sinatra leaned entirely on his charisma and had no real commitment to the work itself. The second name was Marlon Brando. The two never actually worked together, but Richard had strong opinions about Brando's method acting habits, the refusal to memorize lines, the constant improvisation, the general chaos of it all. Richard once said that some actors need chaos to create, but that he himself preferred focus. Most people who heard that line believed it was aimed squarely at Brando. Third was Tony Curtis, with whom Richard appeared in The Long Ships in 1964. Curtis's obsession with his appearance and the amount of time he spent in the makeup chair rather than preparing for his scenes drove Richard to distraction. People on set remembered Richard's frustration not being about who Curtis was as a person, but about who he pretended to be, all image, no substance. Fourth was Robert Mitchum, whose famous laid-back attitude and habit of bragging about doing almost no preparation for his roles was deeply offensive to Richard. Mitchum once openly said he just showed up, hit his mark, and said the lines. For someone like Richard, who approached every performance like a serious battle, that mindset was simply unforgivable. After watching Mitchum in a film, Richard reportedly told a friend that you don't coast your way to greatness. The fifth name was perhaps the most surprising, Kirk Douglas. In some ways, the two men were cut from similar cloth, fierce, intense, and larger than life on screen. But that similarity may have been part of the problem. Richard found Douglas overbearing, always angling for the spotlight, too loud and too grand for the kind of controlled, careful work that Richard valued. There is even a story that Richard once turned down a major role opposite Douglas, saying there was only room for one storm in a scene, and that Kirk brought the whole hurricane. Despite all of that, Richard Widmark never once let those feelings spill into public. He never fed the gossip columns, never took cheap shots in interviews, and kept his private opinions exactly where they belonged. The work was what mattered to him, always, and that commitment earned him something that outlasted any award: genuine respect from the people who knew him and the audiences who watched him.
He carried on working through the 1970s and into the 1980s, appearing in Murder on the Orient Express in 1974, alongside Lauren Bacall in an all-star cast, and Hanky Panky in 1982, which was directed by his old friend Sidney Poitier and starred Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner. By 1987, he was 72 years old and willing to admit the grind had lost its appeal. He said with a wry smile that making movies had started to irritate him, and that with only so many good years left, he had no interest in spending 12 hours on a set just to produce 2 minutes of film. Over his full career, he appeared in more than 70 movies, and while he was proud of all of it, it was his Western roles that people remembered most. In February 1990, at the age of 75, he received one of the most meaningful honors of his life, the D.W. Griffith Lifetime Achievement Award. It was presented to him by his dear friend Sidney Poitier, who flew all the way to California for the occasion. Richard was deeply moved and could hardly believe Poitier had made that trip just for him. Poitier looked at him and said simply that for Richard, he would have walked. But that same year brought heartbreak of a different kind. His beloved wife, Jean, was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Without a second thought, Richard stepped back from acting to be by her side full-time. He returned only once more, in 1991's True Colors, to honor a commitment he had already made. The years that followed were deeply painful for Richard, for their daughter Anne, and for everyone close to the family, as they watched Jean slowly fade away. On March 2, 1997, Gene Widmark passed away in Santa Barbara, California. Richard was devastated. He sold their beloved 80-acre ranch in Hidden Valley shortly after. Without her there, he said, it simply no longer felt like home. About 2.5 years later, on September 27, 1999, Richard married actress Susan Blanchard, a longtime family friend who had always been kind to Gene. The two settled together in Roxbury, Connecticut. In 2002, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, a fitting tribute to a man whose Western performances had helped define the genre for an entire generation.
By 2007, his health had begun to decline, and a fractured vertebra made daily life difficult. But those who were close to him said he remained exactly the same person he had always been: humble, gentle, and gracious. On March 24, 2008, Richard Widmark passed away peacefully at his home in Roxbury, Connecticut, at the age of 93. The people who loved him remembered him not just for his films, but for the way he lived, quietly, with principle, with loyalty, and with an extraordinary amount of grace.